Welcome to PICT Voices, the interview series conducted by faculty of the Paris Institute for Critical Thinking with notable members of the broader PICT community. Our goal is to present our community with a variety of voices across the spectrum of the humanities and critical creative thinking. My name is Kristof Vanhoutte, and today I am joined by Burghard Baltrusch, Professor of Lusophone Literature and the International José Saramago Chair at the University of Vigo. Hello, Burghard, and welcome.
Hello, Kristof.
And as the name of your chair reveals, Burghard, I am thrilled today to talk about José Saramago. Now, last year, we were able to assist in a strange phenomenon, and not just because of the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, there were a couple of older books that returned prominently on the bestsellers lists. There was obviously Daniel Defoe's book On the Plague in London and Camus' novel The Plague. But most of all, there was Saramago's Blindness. And almost an infinity of people rushed to read or reread this book in this troubled year. So you reread it, which is a very good thing. But more importantly, why do you think this was the case? And why do you think it was a good choice by those who did reread this book?
Okay, of course. Thank you. Thank you very much, Kristof. First of all, for inviting me to do this podcast, and congratulations for the excellent job you are doing at the Paris Institute for Critical Thinking. Okay. And yes, of course, last year I immediately came back to Blindness. And I also made my students in Vigo read and discuss it. And I gave a virtual open class lecture on it to other students in Bogota, Colombia, because I was very interested in seeing how they reacted to that book. And of course, there were also other books that crossed my mind, but I feel that Blindness is far more interesting to reread in these times than The Plague, for example. Camus wrote about the German invasion of France and the Resistance, where Saramago created, I think, a more timeless and universal description and critique of human behavior, of humanity and its civilization. But both novels have also aspects in common. They highlight things like human dilemmas, like cowardice versus engagement, opportunism versus small heroism, pettiness and egoism versus generosity. And they also refer to great and almost eternal human ideals like the necessity of love and goodness, happiness, mutual connection, and so on. But one of the great differences is that Camus' novel lacks important female characters. And in this sense, I feel it is somewhat old-fashioned, and it might be questionable if it will prevail in a post-patriarchal world. Because Saramago's wife of the doctor in Blindness is, I think, an absolutely outstanding literary figure. She combines aspects of a classic tragical hero with those of a modern existentialist individual. And she even offers sometimes glimpses of an almost ecofeminist activist. Saramago has been one of the first male authors in Portugal who intentionally deconstructed patriarchalism in his literature, and his women protagonists are altogether admirable. But I think that many readers also returned to Blindness because it is a powerful political metaphor, especially for our postmodern, neoliberal, partially already post-democratic and sometimes increasingly illiberal societies in the West. There's the fear of a loss of democratic freedom, which many Europeans shared during the confinement, and the feeling that this loss may happen rapidly from almost one day to the other, and that our political and health systems, for instance, are incapable of dealing rapidly with such an epidemic, and that they are incapable of efficiently saving lives without excessive restriction of freedom, and that we cannot deal in a reasonable way with the dilemma between saving lives and the planet or just saving capitalist economy. And the ethical and political background of these and many other problems of our time is central to Saramago's writing. And I found it almost an irony of fate when Blindness was adapted in last August. in London by Simon Stevens as one of the first plays staged according to the social distancing determined by the COVID-19 pandemic. And in order to better adapt it, they chose to redesign the play as a sound installation in which the public listened through headphones to the text narrated by only one actress. Unfortunately, I didn't see it, but this reinforcement of the idea of isolation and this double distancing must have been quite impressive. And there's another aspect why Blindness might be considered politically very up to date. Saramago often said when he gave interviews after the publication of the novel that this book was criticizing and unmasking a rotten and disengaged society, as he said. And that this rottenness is because we, as Western societies, became increasingly blind, because instead of tackling the big problems, we prefer to see less. And even today, we still prefer not to look. And I think things have not changed. It has been pointed out, for example, that the COVID-19 epidemic is only a result of climate change, ultimately of what they call the Anthropocene, or what others call even the Capitalocene. Global warming, growing epidemic dangers, migrations, political unrest, and so on are seen by many scholars as a clear consequence of capitalism. And Saramago referred to many of these interrelations already before his Nobel Prize in 1998. And with Blindness, he became a kind of Tiresias of our Western civilization, which is falling apart. Well, I don't know if this answer met your expectations.
Yeah, sure. It's just the thing is our civilization might be falling apart, but the book ends nice.
Yeah,
even though. so I think that's also very important that we can get through this, and I think that's also an important message from the book, that there are very dire situations, but mankind can also be kind and can get through it. But I think Blindness shouldn't have been the only book by Saramago people should have read or reread. I think, for example, that also the history of the Siege of Lisbon should have been up there in these lists as well. In fact, in our COVID world, where numbers are written down, then changed, and then rechanged once again, the story of the proofreader, Raimundo Silva, who changed a fundamental sentence in a history book by simply inserting the word "not," should have been equally revealing today.
Oh, yes, indeed. There are many books of Saramago that we could relate to what has happened in this last year. But in the history of the Siege of Lisbon, you mentioned, Raimundo Silva inserted this "not" in a manuscript. He had to proofread, and he did it because he decided to deny official history's affirmation that the Templars helped the Portuguese conquering the city of Lisbon in the Middle Ages. He found it necessary to introduce an error because he wanted to promote a shift of attention. We could reproduce that strategy of him, for example, in a sentence like this. We could say, today, the COVID pandemic is not our main problem. But who would not agree that it is our most urgent problem? What's the use of denying something that seems to be so evident? Wouldn't that be another kind of Trumpism? But I don't think so, because the world's main problem remains climate change. Obviously, the COVID pandemic has to be solved, but it also blinds us. The climate clock says we have 6 years left to avoid the worst. Other scientific institutions say we have 12 years left, others a tiny bit more. But all agree that within the next 2 decades, we will be facing events that might be much worse than COVID-19. But we should also read or reread other books of Saramago. And I think you will agree with me that Seeing, published in 2004, is one of them. And this novel is somewhat a continuation, or better, a completion of the essay on blindness. In Seeing, people become lucid, and a vast majority of voters cast blank ballots during an election. The government reacts aggressively, accusing its own citizens of terrorism. And I think it's about how our supposedly democratic institutions fail to respond to reality, as Saramago had always warned they would. And there's an interesting text by Ursula K. Le Guin, whose literary work I consider philosophically as important as Saramago's. And she said that seeing says more about the days we are living in than any book she had read. Unfortunately, she died in 2018, and we will not know how she would have related the recent pandemic to Saramago's writing. But the anarchical action Raimundo Silva takes in the history of the Siege of Lisbon, the way in which the wife of the doctor in Blindness takes the law into her own hands, besides so many other examples in Saramago's fiction, can be compared to the situation of the police commissioner in Seeing. There's the idea of freedom as a moral orientation, of the liberating character of action, be it individually or collectively. Almost all of Saramago's protagonists break in certain moments with the given circumstances. They take free choices that transcend their individuality, but they always take others in consideration. In Seeing, I think the idea of freedom appears in a very Sartrean way, as a liberating political action, as an individual practice by the commissioner, but also a collective one by the survivors of blindness and all those who had cast blank ballots. They all take responsibility for their action and in their social and historic context, of course. And Saramago suggests that any ethical and moral orientation can only be deduced from this kind of ontology of freedom. Well, more or less, that's what I think about it.
Okay. Now, and I think maybe next elections will prove how prophetic his book Seeing was. Maybe changing the context of COVID and entering a little bit more into Saramago's work, I think the last question brings us also to one of the fundamental aspects in Saramago's writing, namely his peculiar take on history. And I remember one of his most poignant phrases in responding why he wrote historical novels. And I always imagined him smiling when he gave this answer. So he responded that his intention was to seek out what had been forgotten in history. Could you maybe expand on this thought, please?
Yes, thank you. The way how history is written and by whom it is written is I think one of the great topoi of Saramago's fiction and essays. And he repeatedly insisted on the well-known fact that history is always written by the winners, and these winners used to be men. Official history lacks, obviously, the perspective of those underprivileged, of women, of the marginalized, and so on. In the history of the Siege of Lisbon, the protagonist Raimundo Silva intentionally rewrites the traditional perspective of how, very specifically, a Galician Portuguese army conquered Arab Lisbon in the Middle Ages. He describes the process no longer as a so-called reconquista, as a reconquest, which is what the educational systems in Spain, Portugal, and also around the world still transmit, quite stubbornly, I think, generation after generation. But there was no reconquest because the kingdoms of Portugal and Spain did not yet exist when the Arab-Berber invasion took place. And Portuguese and Spaniards conquered and colonized a multicultural south of the Iberian Peninsula and assimilated its population. But even modern historiography resists a redefinition of this myth because obviously Christian Catholic culture remains very dominant. Today we are facing a growing insecurity of how we should interpret reality, and Saramago always pointed at what official history left and leaves out. I can't help getting back to the COVID pandemic because it shows again how little attention we pay to those who are the real losers, those without access to hospitals and vaccines, like the indigenous people in Brazil, for example. Viruses brought by Europeans killed millions since the Portuguese arrived in the 16th century. And not only that, these indigenous people still have to defend themselves against the myth of having been discovered, or against an ongoing colonization by an aggressive capitalist economy. But on top of that, nowadays, miners and woodcutters also spread coronavirus amongst them. And Saramago would certainly have stood up against this second wave genocide, which is going on there, with the approval of the Bolsonaro government. And that's a genocide that the Brazilian government is committing against his own people. So the official history of this situation is as deficient as the history of the origin of Portugal's kingdom in the Middle Ages. It's a kind of almost intentional blindness. And that's also what Raimundo Silva's subversion is about. Saramago obviously always tried to turn the forgotten visible and to empower them, at least through fiction. Be it the poor peasants in the Alentejo before the revolution, erased from the ground, or the 4,000 workers who built the convent of Mafra in Baltazar and Blimunda. But as you have pointed out, he also frequently denied being a writer of historical novels. He maintained that all fiction is historical, and that he was only committed to what he once called reinventing history, in the sense of bringing to the surface what had been excluded, silenced. And he compared the novelist to the historiographer because he couldn't conceive an apprehension of the world that was not fictional. Today's neuroscientists and cognitivists would love him for that, because our memory is highly selective. So in one of his most crucial essays, which is titled History and Fiction from 1990, he said that both writer and historical researcher are what he called choosers of facts and makers of history. And I think he was also trying to achieve not only a different discourse or alternative narratives, but even a new language, free from patriarchal and traditionally ideological constraints, able to rewrite and change history through poetical expression. He wanted to show us what is heterogeneous to meaning, and that everything is open to social historical constraint. In a long interview he published in 1998, he said that his conception of rewriting history was an attempt of what he called a totalizing description, of trying to say everything. That is also to say an attempt of including all voices and perspectives which used to be excluded. Of course, today we would say in a decolonized, non-hierarchical, even anarchical sense. Well, perhaps this is more or less what you had in mind.
Thank you. Now, let's return for a minute to blindness. It has been claimed that after the Gospel of Jesus, something changed in Saramago's work. And Saramago himself also alluded to this change. Now, most scholars have called the work beginning from blindness his so-called allegorical work. Could you maybe explain to our listeners what is meant by this, and then maybe afterwards we can discuss a bit what I think is somewhat mistaken with this terminology?
Okay. Well, the first time Saramago mentioned this change in his work was in a lecture in Turin, in Italy, in 1998, shortly after the Nobel Prize, where he compared his work to a stone statue. Until the Gospel According to Jesus Christ, he published in 1991, he said that you would have been describing the surface of the statue. But since blindness, he said he was trying to describe the material itself. He wanted to penetrate the interior of the stone, looking for what he thought to be essential for what usually remains hidden. It was, of course, a quest for an even deeper understanding of things, but there's also more to it. because the gospel according to Jesus Christ had been censored by Portugal's neoliberal government, who removed his name from a proposal list for the European Union Prize for Literature in 1992. And in the aftermath of the following polemic, Saramago decided to leave Portugal and to start a new life in Lanzarote. And later on, he even described this island as his personal stone raft, in allusion to the other novel of the same title from '86. But in an essay he wrote for the Times Literary Supplement, which was published in '88, I think, he already had made it quite clear that this shift away, first from Portugal, then from Europe, began very early in his life. And paradoxically, this becoming more and more universal of his work and thinking helped to root himself even deeper in his Portuguese and originally rural identity. There's another Portuguese writer who also spent his whole life outside of Portugal, who was Jorge de Sena, and who went into exile during the dictatorship and became one of the greatest modern Portuguese humanists and universalists. And Saramago somewhat followed his footsteps and became also a great modernizer of Portuguese and Iberian culture. And this idea of trans-Ibericity of his is, I think, is one of the most operative terms to describe today and to think all those cultures which were triggered by Portuguese and Spanish colonizations. And that's quite a big part of our planet. But you are also right that there's indeed a lot of imprecise terminology used to describe Saramago's writing and thinking. Let's take the term magical realism, for instance, a European invention to describe a Latin American and African literary cosmovision and style, which certain Western perspectives were not able to understand. And Saramago's use of fantastic elements cannot be seen as analogous, for example, to that of Garcia Marquez, whose influence on Saramago is sometimes overrated. Saramago's use of what we might call fantastic or supernatural events is always a tool for questioning standardized social and political history and its narratives. He asks, what if this would have happened? What if people could do this? And what if we could change things this way? And the idea is, of course, to show the reader something very Marxist on the one hand and very existentialist on the other. Like you as a human being can always make something meaningful of what the circumstances did with you. But in order to do so, you must translate me. You must interpret me critically. As Saramago once said, we are all translators, and translation is always political.
No, I agree, and I also think, and I particularly don't like the idea of the allegory here, because I think it's a refuge. I think it's a means to make the so-called romanticized intrinsic ideas that Saramago puts forward, of taking them not really seriously. Yesterday, for example, I was reading, and I think this is a good allegory if we want. I was reading something that Benjamin wrote on the prose of Kafka. And so Benjamin said that Kafka's texts, they are not parables, but neither are they texts that one can take at face value. And I think this is pretty much what is going on with Saramago's text as well. They are not allegories, but they're also not realistic novels. And I would call them, in a certain sense, the Agamben paradigm. It's something that he thinks about, that he invents, or that he fictionalizes, but that also could become in real. And I think, especially with Seeing and also with Blindness, because these are the two books that I care most about in Saramago's oeuvre, I think that they are really, and this pandemic, again, turning back to it, this is what really is happening today.
Yes, of course. The question of the allegorical, of the allegory, what most critics mean when they speak of the allegorical in Saramago's writing is of course often a simplification, mostly in literary studies, and I agree that there's a generally improper use of this term. Saramago did not create allegories in the sense of, say, rhetorical tropes or an allegoresis in the theological sense. What we can of course use the word in a meaning restricted to literary studies, where allegoresis is just a hermeneutical technique. But what Saramago is concerned, I would prefer, and I agree with you, a usage of the term following the redefinition which proposed Walter Benjamin. Benjamin's understanding of allegory is that, well, I'm not a philosopher, but I would say it's a kind of dissociation of a profound difference between the use of language and its cultural past, of something which breaks up any classical metaphysical relation between the image as being and its meaning. And this understanding of allegory relates always to decay, to the finitude of everything which is historical or natural. The work of art can no longer be seen as a totality, capable of conciliating contradictions. Benjamin's materialistic redefinition of allegory represents a sort of deconstruction and a kind of anticipation, perhaps, of Derrida, and it's up to the reader, to us, and there we come back to Saramago, to reconstruct meaning, at least partially. As with Benjamin, there's also in Saramago an ongoing and never-ending process of deconstruction and reconstruction of meaning, as Benjamin said, a continuum of transformations, and I even would say a continuum of translations. And in a somewhat comparable way, I think we could say that Saramago created blindness and seeing as allegories, but it's quite it would be necessary to explain this very well. But in this sense, they are allegories which also deconstruct and ultimately deny any metaphysical meaning. And this is very important because Saramago's atheism is absolutely fundamental for an appropriate understanding of his writing and thinking. And I would also maintain that with Saramago happens something very similar as with Sartre. If we don't accept their atheism, we will never fully understand their thinking. And I say that because in literary studies, there are lots of people who are trying to save Saramago from atheism. And there are many attempts that tried to force some kind of spiritual interpretation on Saramago's writing and thinking, which of course are a fallacy. But these desperate misinterpretations also show how difficult it is still for many of his readers to accept a literature that not only denies transcendence, but where the Christian God, when he appears, and he appears quite often, happens to be the bad guy, and its Bible a compendium of bad habits. That's the words, that's the expression Saramago used once. But I agree, it's not enough, and it's even perhaps futile trying to save the term allegory. You are right. There's indeed something more important, and that's the paradigmatic character in Blindness and Seeing. And already from an etymological point of view, the meaning of example, model, sample, of something a priori to experience, although it always has to be compared to experience in Saramago. And you are also right when you highlight the importance of the essayistic character of Saramago's writing, which I also think is fundamental. Blindness and Seeing are essays because they imply that there is a kind of setup of an experiment. As always, Saramago wants to know what happens if. He once said he was an essayist who needed to write novels because he didn't know how to write essays, which was, of course, an understatement because many of his novels are excellent essays. But this essayistic character of his novels is very important because it always raises new questions, outlines new problems. And he developed a style which intentionally tries to avoid moralizing and dogmatic doctrines. Saramago was an admirer of Montaigne, not of Francis Bacon, because like Montaigne, he always allows the reader to make his own associations. He even requires him to develop his own views and thoughts. And besides, he was obviously a political essayist, and therefore he was harshly criticized by conservatives and the church. Montaigne's essays were placed on the index, and even at the end of the 20th century, an essayistic novel of Saramago became censored. And in this sense, it's indeed a pity that the English translations decided to domesticate the titles of Blindness and Seeing. They should have been essay on blindness, essay on seeing, evidently. And Benjamin would have said that they are bad translations, at least what the titles are concerned.
Mm-hmm. Now, in making the circle round, I would like to conclude by having a look at seeing and how lucid one needs to be. And I want to end this with a provocation. Now, for as much as we already explained, this is a rather thoroughly disturbing novel. Again, not an allegorical one, but a paradigmatic one. I cannot think about this text as not being also one of the most hopeful ones that I think I've ever read. Even though all socio-political structures have collapsed in the novel, and the people, the people are abandoned by their political leaders, they, however, don't abandon themselves then in the orgiastic explosion of violence that has been predicted by the former government. And I think that, first of all, this is very true. And it has also recently been confirmed by a lovely book called Humankind by Rutger Bregman. But secondly, I think it's also important because it goes against so much of our dystopian literature and dystopian political theory. And I don't think, by the way, also that is exclusive to seeing in Saramago's work as well. I think it's always there. So would you agree with this, that there's this even though this negative, harshly negative, realistic view, there's also this possibility of a positivity in the end?
Yes, there is. The only thing I would say is that we have to put it in a very specific context, which is a bit difficult for me to explain, because there's still a great debate going on this within literary studies, because Saramago is, as you have pointed out, considered a very pessimistic author. Mm-hmm. But I agree that this is not the central point. As we have already said before, all his fiction was about this world, about real people, but also other animals, about real suffering, about solidarity, about changing the circumstances in a human way, about ethic responsibility. And that's also why his thoughts and literature could be transformed into a proposal of a universal charter of duties and obligations of the individuals, which has already been submitted to the United Nations, because Saramago suggested that the Human Rights Charter is not enough to guide humanity. There is of course a positiveness and hope in Saramago, but there is also this other aspect which people like to call his pessimistic character. Well, there's of course an aspect of Portuguese mentality here, but that's perhaps not so much interesting for our discussion. But what is interesting is reminding his last diary of Lanzarote, which was only discovered recently in an old computer of his, and it was edited in 2018, 2 years ago. And in this diary, which he wrote in 1998 during the Nobel Prize year, he said that after Blindness, something changed in him. And he said that this was especially in relation to literature. He said it was not only that his writing style had changed, but he also began to question the concept and idea of literature itself. He said that he was no longer interested in talking about literature, that he even doubted that it was possible to talk about literature. He left that unexplained, but we can imagine a lot of things, many interpretations. And I think perhaps what he felt was that writing literature which was certainly for him, had been for him an act of desiring freedom, as Sartre would have put it, but that this was not enough. Before, during, and shortly after the Portuguese Revolution, writing certainly had been for Saramago an act of liberating humanity. But through the change he underwent after Blindness, I think he felt that literature was excessively strangled by things like the regime of textual genres, critical narratives, cliches, the literary market, and so on. And he surely always wanted writers and artists to intervene, to be political, but he also was very skeptical what the supposed power of literary fiction was concerned, because he already had abandoned and transformed neorealism long ago. He, on the one hand, he didn't want to be characterized as a writer with a project or a mission of cultural, social, and political intervention. He felt that that what he had done was not enough, that such projects must fail, and that these kinds of missions are only for blind believers. Perhaps only people with a deep-rooted rural background, like his, and who know what poverty really is, are capable of this humbleness and critical self-awareness. But for many readers, he was, and still is, a writer with a political message that gives orientation in a world which is out of joint. And they are absolutely right. And here comes the positiveness and the hope. Because the optimism we can retrieve from his work and activism lies precisely in this contradiction, that of a humble man who did not want to believe in the power he had, but who assumed the necessity of a political way of life, of an ethics of individual and collective responsibility, in defiance of all these inevitable pessimisms which the circumstances impose on us. I don't know if I explained myself.
You do. It makes perfect sense. And I was recently working on Raymond Williams, and I found some of his considerations of hope to return so much in Saramago as well, because it's a hope that it's not just a hope that is put out there and let's just hope all things go well. It's hope as a practice, as a means to actually do something, and especially a hope as practiced by the common people who think they are not able to do it, but who in the end always turn out to be the ones who actually do it. And so I thought I completely agree with the positivity in Saramago needs to be contextualized extremely well, because it's not just something out there, everything ends well, all is good and all is happy. No, it's not that. So I think you made that perfectly clear. And thanks for this. Now, before we said goodbye, next year, 2022, will be an important year for all those interested in Saramago's work. It will in fact be the centenary of his birth. What is there planned at your university, Burghard? Because I think asking what is planned in the world is probably too much to mention.
Oh yes, there will be lots of things going on, especially in Brazil and also in Portugal, obviously. But let me just say that already in December this year we shall have our 6th International Saramago Conference. But obviously we are already preparing what will be happening in 2022 with the celebration of the 100th birthday. And hopefully the 7th International Conference will be on Saramago's philosophical and political heritage, an idea and title we borrowed from the excellent book you and Carlos Salzani edited in 2018. And I think it's really a good moment to get back to relating Saramago with philosophical thinking and also with political thinking and action. And I hope we will see us in person then.
That would be lovely. And I couldn't agree more with the importance on the philosophical importance in Saramago. Well, thank you so much for this, Burghard. It has been a real pleasure talking to you about Saramago, about whom I could go on for days on end, but I won't. So thank you all for listening to one more episode of PICT Voices, and thank you, Burghard, for being with us, and maybe we will meet on some of the many events on Saramago, as I sure will try to attend. So, my name is Kristof Vanhoutte, and thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much.